The title of my presentation today is Queer Cosmopolitanism in a Digital Space, Narratives of Progress and Exclusionary Practices in Gay Community News magazine from 2017 until 2022. As Fergal mentioned, this is part of my PhD project, which looks at kind of different levels of mediated representations of these groups. So I do look at mainstream media representations of the LGBTQ plus community as well, and look kind of mapping the divergences between these two contexts. But for today, I'll be focusing on community representations of the community themselves by focusing on this magazine. So I'm sure many of you, throughout the conference will define cosmopolitanism, but just to, I suppose, situate this study within the kind of more specific domain of queer cosmopolitanisms. Previous research has looked at this mostly in physical and urban spaces in the global north, in global cities. But a point of interest in these studies has always been the exclusionary practices of gay communities within these communities themselves, within these spaces. Or other conceptualizations frame it in terms of the construction of progress. So really this study attempts to do both, or at least to build on both of these notions by looking at a digital space. And just to, I suppose, be clear, I'm not looking at, I suppose, in a digital space, I'm looking at the construction of cosmopolitanism by a queer space or by a digital space. So how does the magazine Gay Community News construct this kind of queer cosmopolitanism? So really my research interest lies at the intersection of queer theories of temporality, spatiality, queer futurity. And I think this has a really interesting synergy with the idea of cosmopolitanism. And I hope to kind of bring that out today, especially in considering these sites and considering their potential for transformative change, really, and transformative progress and new ways of living collectively in difference, both in the present and also in the future. Specifically, the study examines how the magazine articulates these discourses of progress and interrogates processes of representation within the community. And I do this both at a linguistic level through corpus linguistics, but I also include a visual element. So looking at both the text of the articles, but also the images that are used on the covers of the magazines. And I try to complicate the idea that this media outlet presents a very unified and unifying version of community, and to show really that there are multiple hierarchies and processes of exclusion taking place. Now, I don't want to be very grim. There are, processes that are very encouraging and processes of inclusion, but they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So I'll talk about that later. So as I said, it uses textual and visual data between July 2017 and October 2022. The textual data is about just under a million word corpus, and we have about 45 cover images of the same issues. The magazine itself is actually the longest continuous queer periodical in Ireland and the oldest surviving free LGBTI plus magazine in Europe. So I think that's quite interesting. So there's something here, there's something about the magazine that's lasting, And they claim, a former editor, in fact, of GCN claims that the magazine has a really important part to play in the mentoring of LGBTI plus youth. And I thought this was really interesting in the sense of this mentoring, It kind of suggests that there's something to be taught, or something that can be taught, a particular way of living within this community and acting within this community. So this is really, I think, is where we can kind of bring all these intersections of different theories and of cosmopolitanism into play. So I'm aware that the audience here is interdisciplinary and not everyone maybe is familiar with corpus linguistics. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of what it is. And this will also be helpful for my colleagues' talk later, Maria and Marta, because I know they use corpus linguistics as well. So essentially, when I'm talking about a corpus, I'm talking about a large electronic database of language. And the purpose of these is to examine patterns within the language, patterns in frequency, but also patterns relative to other bodies of language that can be tested using various tools within the software. The software I use is called Sketch Engine. And I suppose the most important thing to remember about a corpus is that it can vary in size and nature, but there has to be a link between your kind of research questions and also the nature of the corpus. So for example, here I want to interrogate representations of the LGBTI plus community. I'm not going to gather articles about football because that's not going to tell me anything meaningful. Okay, so this domain specificity is key when building the corpus. And it's been very successfully combined with discourse studies. And actually, it's ideally, Baker tells us, it's ideally positioned to examine questions around discourse and representations of sexuality, particularly so in cases where text producers are more careful in terms of openly expressing prejudice. So a couple of tools, just very quickly. We have frequency lists. This is what they look like on the left. Essentially, these are the most frequent items in the corpus. By themselves, these aren't necessarily an extremely useful tool because, of course, you'd expect LGBT to be frequent in this corpus. That doesn't tell us anything by itself. But we combine this with other tools, and one of the most valuable really are keyword searches. And this is where you compare your corpus to another corpus. So it gives you frequency, but also salience of different terms compared to other bodies of language. So for example, here we might look at number 9 on the right-hand side, asylum. That's not necessarily something you'd expect to find in a corpus that represents or that aims to represent the LGBT community. So this is what then we'd kind of follow up on to look at for further information. These keyword searches are useful because they allow us to categorize the kind of narratives there and clues to the discourses that are at play in the data. So here on the left, for example, we can see that there's a huge amount of organizations. There's a massive domain of medical and health, which again isn't something you'd necessarily expect. But also things like events, locations, activism was another topic here that came up. So I'll come back to some of these specifically as I discuss my findings, but just to show you the kind of use of these tools. What we do then is we look at concordances, which are looking at these key terms in context. So they'll show you the left context and the right context. And it's necessary to kind of dive in and do close readings of these to really see how these terms are used in the corpus and what its collocates are, or what does it frequently appear with. And this is very much a qualitative element to the more quantitative nature of corpus linguistics. So I might move on now to just some findings because this is really the more interesting stuff. And if anyone has any questions about corpus linguistics, I'm very happy to take them afterwards. But the first thing I want to talk about is the nomenclature and the kind of community infrastructure that's presented by the magazine. And you might think, okay, yeah, this is obvious. Of course, there's going to be reference to all of these different organizations and people. But actually, you know, this isn't done in mainstream representations of the community. This only appears in community representations of the community itself. And I think this is important because it highlights that these support services are available. It highlights this infrastructure that exists, you know, within and for this community. But it also, however, represents an in-group knowledge of these structures and networks and of people. And this can actually be very difficult to access sometimes. So yeah, as I said, we have support services, activists, artists, pop icons. I think there's only one keyword that I did in a different iteration of the keyword search that isn't a person who's a member of the community, and that's Vladimir Putin. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a while, but it is interesting that everyone else is a member of the community. Even politicians who are mentioned are members of the community. You know, it is this tool that is important for promoting clarity and facilitating effective communication. And actually, this is something against which these communities have always struggled. So in this sense, we can kind of look at it as maybe a future building project, you know, kind of saying to the community, look, these things exist, this support is here, this network exists. So that I think is interesting to think about. But as I said, who has access to this information? I didn't know all of these people, you know, I'm Irish in this community. I didn't know all these organizations. I had to look them up. So it is very much an in-group infrastructure. The next thing that I thought was very interesting was the semantic domain of medicine and also health, in particular sexual health. And this was highly, highly salient statistically relative to other corpora, both mainstream media representations and compared to general English corpora. And again, it's not something that you'd expect really to find. So I thought this was interesting. I thought maybe the pandemic was the cause of this. And it is a factor, but actually many of the terms are unrelated to the pandemic. So for example, vaccines refers to HPV, testing refers to HIV, rapid testing, and diagnosis refers to HIV diagnosis. So actually the COVID-19 pandemic subcorpus is tiny comparatively. Now, medical discursive framing of homosexuality has been criticized. It is a historical medical discourse, but this historical discourse actually pathologized homosexuality itself, and that's not exactly what's happening here. And it is possible maybe to be critical of the fact that the community is still drawing on historical discourses that were harmful. But we can also maybe view this as the reclamation of a discourse space that's been reoperationalized to educate and inform. However, despite being the most salient category of keywords on a textual level, this doesn't appear at all in the visuality of the corpus. So I thought that was interesting. I'm not sure why. Then this got me thinking maybe about the possibility of the caliber of sexual health services presented maybe as proof of this kind of liberal or cosmopolitan status. We've transcended maybe this old-fashioned Ireland that was sexually oppressed. So kind of constructing cosmopolitanism relative to another temporality, another spatiality. However, there's a flip side to this, and this is the idea that maybe this very salient semantic domain is amplifying the idea that LGBTI plus people are promiscuous and sexually risky. And actually, the keywords are very explicit in this domain. We have things such as anal, STIs, condom. And as I said, this could be indicative of an effort to educate, but it does also reproduce this trope as people as promiscuous and sexually risky. When we look at the coding of the visual corpus, we can see that actually this second reading is kind of reinforced. Bare skin is used hugely, bodies, leather, allusions to kink. These are all key elements of the materiality of the visual corpus. Again, reinforcing this idea of deviant hypersexuality central to this idea of community membership. So again, not something everyone can access or wants to access or should have to access. So again, this idea of an imagined community that's transcended this traditional secrecy around sex. And actually this level of sexual freedom has often been used as a determiner of how people and places are positioned in narratives of modernity and progress. So a sign of national progress, perhaps. The next thing is narratives of visibility. So this is where I looked at the specific identity labels and looked at the concordances and the close readings of how these terms were used. And it's a very uneven representation. So while trans and non-binary are actually much more salient than maybe in a mainstream corpus, they're very often almost exclusively discussed within a very limiting frame of healthcare, as opposed to wider discussions of experiences of different things, joy, discrimination. It's very confined to this medical category. So this really is more linked to the previous pathologizing discourse that we saw back in the 70s and 80s and before even. Lesbian does not even appear as a key term, which is in keeping with kind of a tradition of erasure of lesbian and bisexual identities in Ireland in particular. And the term queerness often collocates with aspects of culture, so including the arts in particular. And it's interesting that we can kind of see that non-engagement with these elements of the community does result actually in this in-group, out-group dynamic that we can criticize as possibly elitist and classist. However, I'd like to take more of a positive view about this idea of the arts. I do kind of see it as almost a future building project through engaging in queer art. Visually, this is conflated with color, with joy, with music, with visual arts, with expression. So I do think it is part of this wider project of increasing visibility and almost as a counter to this kind of mainstreaming and pinkwashing that goes on around pride in particular of corporations, by corporations. But again, we can criticize this as potentially classist. I'm coming to the end now. You'll be happy to know. But there are a couple of other things that I'd just like to mention briefly, and maybe we can pick them up in the discussion. This I thought was very interesting. There's a huge politicization of the community by the magazine, including calls to action. So rebellion, revolt, revolution, fighting back. These are all very frequent ideas. And actually what we see is the community is moving away from issues that directly affect the community to other political and social issues. So we can see here the North is Next is one example on the right, which references Northern Ireland. We have the Year of the Activist. We look at, things happening in Russia. So we can actually see this kind of picture of the modern gay in Ireland emerging as a very left-wing radical who takes on all these causes as their own. So I thought that was interesting. And actually this radicalization increases over time. As I mentioned, Russia, Putin, Chechnya, these all came up as salient or as terms of interest in the corpus. And here I think we can look at this as a glimpse of queer hope in a sense that GCN is constructing Ireland as a place of refuge for those fleeing persecution. And actually this isn't just lip service. These people are given voice. This is an example of a very prominent activist who's a refugee from Russia in Ireland on the right. So it's in the visuality of the corpus. It's discussion throughout the corpus, and these are also our key terms. But this again is possibly evidence of constructing cosmopolitanism relative to more backward states. Backward, of course, in inverted commas. However, this actually isn't the case for all issues. And what I'll highlight here, and I know I'm running out of time now, but is the corpus is very white, is what I would say. I didn't find it difficult to find examples of white skin. As I mentioned, skin is a very, it's a tool used in the visuality of the corpus. It was very difficult to find people who didn't have white skin. These are the only examples. And actually what we have potentially is a commodification of diversity and of difference because, Black Lives Matter didn't appear as a key term. These issues don't appear as salient to the textual corpus, yet they are almost commodified in the visual corpus. I have a couple of more findings, but maybe I'll leave them to the discussion. Things to do with marriage, a kind of a resistance versus an assimilation discourse that seems to be at play. But maybe just to conclude and end this section, is I feel there are contesting ideologies being constructed by the magazine. On one hand, we have a politics of respectability and a mainstreaming of the community. So kind of this "we're like you" idea linked to homonormativity, which is the idea that there's a way to be gay, but also a more radical queerness that does contend with this agenda and is very politically active. And I think what's happening is subjects are constructing their subjectivities in terms of multiple shifting and contradictory subject positions by taking up a range of discourses and social practices. Okay, I might leave it there for now, and maybe we can move on to the discussion. And this is, a lot of what I've said already. But I suppose one more important thing to say is that really economic, social, and cultural capital are really required to enter these queer spaces. And this, of course, is something that we can criticize and has been criticized in studies of queer cosmopolitanism in the past. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take some questions.